Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is part 2 of episode 7. We have Josh Lloyd returning to the podcast. Josh is a lead fantasy basketball analyst at Basketball Monster, the man behind the mic on the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast, and founder of Red Rock Fantasy Basketball. In this 2-part episode, Josh talks about all things NBA, DFS, and how the daily fantasy industry is evolving. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests that you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Josh Lloyd. So what's a typical week for you then? Obviously you've got other things to do, but for a typical DFS player, are you sort of following a rigid structure? Are you watching a lot of games and then putting in your lineups at a certain time every day and doing that over and over, or is it the same for everyone?
I don't think it's the same for everyone. For me, it involves obviously the timing of games here is different. So during the bulk of the NBA season, the game started at 11 a.m. where I am. So you get up in the morning. I have my work to do for Basketball Monster in terms of monitoring the news that's happening, putting out our updates and adjusting our projections when players are ruled in, ruled out, starting lineup changes. So I have that stuff to do. But before my sort of time on the clock with that starts, I go through and read up what's happened in the past 6 hours that I've been asleep. What's the latest news on players' statuses, who's in, who's out, and then start to build my lineups from there. But I've already done 2-3 hours research the day before in preparing to do the podcast, and then speaking about the DFS portion for 40 minutes there, and have my base research, and then coming in the next morning and saying, all right, so what's changed from where I mentioned it last night? What's altered, and then build lineups from there. Which I honestly don't spend hours building lineups because I spend hours doing the work beforehand. But when I come in, I go, this is what I want to do. Let's have a look at what's changed. Let's build them, stick them in, and go from there.
So I'm sure there's DFS players listening who aren't professionals. Is there any sort of basic useful tips or tools you could give them? Because I certainly play DFS for NFL every now and then. Is there something on the NBA side that you can say, look, here's 2 or 3 things that you can sort of implement that'll help you win at a better rate than you are, even if you are just a casual player and you want to put in $10 or $20 in a lineup and go from there? Is there any sort of 1 or 2 tools that you have in mind?
Obviously we run our tools over at Basketball Monster with our projection, so that's the number one thing that I'm using. I'm creating it, but I'm also using them when I'm doing my lineups. But it's one thing that I find that people do that ends up with them making mistakes is that they'll look for plays or guys that they want to use, and they'll look at this player and say, who's going to score the most points today? Who's going to score the most fantasy points? And they'll say, it's Russell Westbrook, it's James Harden, it's LeBron. This guy's going to have the most points. Let's put him in a lineup. And that's not the way that I like to look at it, because that's fine, but we're always talking about points to salary ratio. Like, that's what the game is based on.
Yep.
So you could easily win by not having the best 2 guys in, because their price point might be so prohibitive that everyone else you've got to put in becomes so far undervalued that it doesn't work. So I look for who's the value play, who's in, who's out. Is Chris Paul out tonight? So Austin Rivers is starting at point guard, and he's going to be priced $6,000 less and might give you 80% of the value that Chris Paul gave you. So therefore, Austin Rivers is the guy that starts in my lineup. He's the first guy that's in there, and I go, let's build around that. Where else is the value? Who else has been slumping and seen their price drop way down? And there's reasons for it. Like, why has this player shot 30% from the field for the last week, and consequently their price has now dropped by $2,000? They're not going to continue to shoot 30%. They're going up against a team that allows the highest field goal percentage in the league. Everything, all these factors are coming together. So that guy comes into my lineup, even though he's not a player that's going to get 50 points or 60 points. But he might get 40 points and cost me $4,000. So that's a clear win to put him in there as well. And then you build your lineup around that. And then at the end, you might have that $12,000 left over, and you've created all that, and you go, shit, I've got $12,000 left over. I can actually put LeBron in now and feel comfortable about it. And then that's just a cherry on top rather than building with that and trying to find the bargains around it. I like to go with, these are the guys who are going to give me just a real boost on what I need to do and in a great spot. And then let's fill in the gaps around them rather than the other way around.
Interesting. Because, I guess you only hear the outrageous examples, but how efficient are the salaries in the NBA DFS?
Yeah, look, they're pretty good. They're fairly sharp, but the most value you get off them, because they're done like 48 hours in advance in general. So when news breaks in the 24 hours, 12 hours before, that's where the value really comes. So when there's rumors of, say, or LeBron and Kyrie are going to sit for the Cavs for the next game 2 days away, then FanDuel will come out and go, all right, we're bumping Richard Jefferson, we're bumping Darren Williams. Kevin Love's getting $1,000 bump in advance because we know that Kyrie and LeBron are going to sit this game, so those prices are going to go up. But if that news comes out 24 hours before the game starts, then they can't adjust their prices. So that's where you really attack, and that's where you look at it. Was some weird injury news? Did a trade go down and those players can't join the team for the next 24 hours? So the other guys have to play 38 minutes instead of 30 minutes. Like that's where the value comes, because they do set those prices 48 hours in advance. So that window in between is where that value can really, really jump up, and you can get that from there. But otherwise, their pricing is generally okay, but there's always some weird anomalies. I mean, there's always certain players on some sites that are overpriced and underpriced, and guys like Brook Lopez was the real key example to this. Like, he'd always have like a $2,000 price difference between FanDuel and DraftKings. So he'd always be a great play on DraftKings and a terrible play on FanDuel. And there are certain players like that. I never understood why there's certain players would always sit that way, but you could always work that out and say, well, this continues to remain a good play here, but a bad play over there.
So do you think it'll ever get to a stage where those salaries are dynamic? Because an example from this season, Cavs and Spurs, when the information about, LeBron, maybe Kyrie, maybe sitting from the betting side, the odds went from basically, -1 or 2 up to -8 or 9, and then back down to -1 or 2 within, 2 hours. So in that situation, the bookmakers obviously can move the line and account for that. It doesn't sound like that's at all possible in DFS with the way the salaries are structured and fixed. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, they can't do that because they set the contests up in advance to try and get volume in. So if you're waiting to 2 hours before and then you're changing the salaries, well, then you have to start a whole new tournament and you have to try and get that volume in 2 hours instead of 48 hours. So they're looking for that volume. So they set the price. And again, it's because people are going against each other. It's not these sites aren't losing money because LeBron sat and Richard Jefferson started in his place, and like, oh my God, we're getting killed because LeBron's out and there's this value opened up for Richard Jefferson. They're not the ones that are losing the money. It's about the players going against each other. So I can't ever see how dynamic salary changing is going to be a part of it. They set these up 2 days in advance, get the volume in, play it in that way, and then people make their adjustments as the news comes out, but the salaries remain fixed. And I think that's the best way to go about it.
Yeah, it may even be impossible. Obviously, with sports betting, it's a one-click scenario, whereas DFS is more about the lineup and having 4, 5, 6, 7 players in your team, depending on which sport it is. So it sounds like it may just be too difficult. Do you think you could have a situation where you could essentially have sort of, I don't know, I'm just trying to think out loud with the dynamic stuff. It's probably a difficult scenario given they want to have everyone to have plenty of time to put their lineups in. And in that Cavs-Spurs example, there's really nothing you can do. Would there be a huge problem? Because everyone's just going to take Kevin Love if Kyrie and LeBron are sitting, for example, and, Ty Lue's come out and said that Kevin's going to have to take on a bigger load and he's going to play, a lot more, and we're going to have to work the ball through him a lot. If he says that, hours before the game or a day before the game, won't everyone just take Kevin Love? Is that a problem? Does that just make it a 4-man, roster with everyone taking Kevin Love in that scenario? Is that a huge problem?
No, not really, because again, it comes down to that thing that I mentioned earlier. You're talking about the tournaments, and if everyone takes Kevin Love, that's fine. But there have been plenty of examples. Like there's that situation when the Cavs went to Memphis earlier in the season, and LeBron, Kyrie, and Love all sat out. And it was like, oh, cool, we're going to get lots of Iman Shumpert's going to play all these minutes. We're going to get Kay Felder getting big playing time. I don't remember who else was Channing Frye. All these guys. Let's everyone load up on them, and their ownership was high. And then the Cavs got smashed by like 50 points, and none of those guys got even close to returning their value. So if you had have gone away from that, then you would just elevate yourself up into the top 20% of a contest pool automatically, depending on how you've done with the other spots. But you're right up there. So it's not a big deal. And if everyone takes Kevin Love, everyone takes him, and then you differentiate in other areas. It's not a big problem, I don't think. And you have to be able to adapt to that and know if people are taking Kevin Love, then if I'm in a double up, a 50-50 contest, then I probably need to get him as well, so that if he crashes, everyone else crashes, and I'm still in the same spot, and I can win back and push myself into that top 50% with my other players.
So what happens is there a sort of an emergency scenario for DFS if you have LeBron in your team and he sits last minute, or Pop pulls?
Nah, bad luck.
It's just bad luck. So you've really got to be immersed in it, like you said earlier, and be ready to pull the trigger at any stage. How long do you get before sort of official lineups and game time?
Well, that's part of the big problem with NBA DFS is that there's no set rules. There's no set announcement that they have to make at a certain time, and it's something that I complain about quite a bit. Not only just from the DFS point of view, just from the common sense or optics part of it. There was a stage at one point, I think maybe in March, with Detroit and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. Detroit had their official starting lineup, and he's normally starting for them at shooting guard, and they had their lineup, and down the bottom, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope out, personal problems, or no, personal. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope out, personal. The beat writers tweeted that out, so we go, cool, KCP's out, someone's going to start. I don't remember who it was, Reggie Bullock, Darren Hilliard, Stan Johnson. I don't remember. Okay, cool. KCP's out, let's start one of these guys. They come in at minimum salary, they're going to have value. And then it turns out, halfway through the game, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope arrives at the arena and starts the second half because he was with his missus who was giving birth to their baby, and then he was allowed to come in and play the second half.
Wow.
So that's definitely frustrating when this stuff comes out. There's no, it's not like in the NFL where it's like you've got that time frame, you've got to announce your inactives, and they've got to be announced at a time 3 hours before the game starts. These coaches don't have to do that. It goes right down to sometimes starting lineups, even by the teams, don't get announced until the game tips off. Sometimes you have to watch it and go, who's coming on the court to start this game? You go, okay, well that's who's starting now, because no one has announced it. It hasn't been mentioned. They don't have to say who's in or out. They'll have players who are injured, but they still dress them in the uniform, and then they might come in. The whole portion of that is a real problem for DFS and the gambling side of things, because coaches they don't have to, so they don't release the information that they need to release to help us. They don't tell you starting lineups. They don't they'll have a press conference half an hour before the game. Who's starting? Oh, you'll find out later on, and you find out when they walk on the court, or the team announces it, and then when they walk on the court, it's a different starter anyway. So there is no set rule, and it's really frustrating.
Yeah, it sounds a bit strange, but I guess you'd have to mandate that pretty seriously to get that sort of in a way that works for DFS players. And I'm sure that certain people aren't too worried about that side of it as yet, but maybe in the future it'll be a topic. So is there any way, I guess me thinking out loud again, is there any way for peer-to-peer sort of, I know you can play, I'm sure you can play single games, right? You can play against one person rather than in a...
Yep.
So can you see their lineup before it hits the deadline ever? Or is it only a closed scenario where basically as soon as it's locked, then you get to see who you're up against?
From memory, you see who you're up against. You obviously can't see their lineups until it's locked, but you can see who you're playing against once you enter the contest.
Okay, because I'm just thinking about sort of the Betfairs of the world, the exchanges where if you want to go on and bet against a horse or bet against a team or bet against an over-under, things like that, you can. I'm just trying to think if there's any sort of equivalent with DFS where it might be, you know what, I've got these 5 players, I want to play a $50 head-to-head match on DFS in an exchange style, and then someone else can come in and pick 5 players and go against it, and you might get, different odds or things like that. I'm just wondering if the DFS industry are sort of moving down any sort of new technology, new games, anything like that, which would make it a bit more exciting and more enticing for not only casual players, but the professionals as well. Because if you, let's say you didn't like James Harden for some reason, and you didn't like another player, a high-profile player, you might want to say, you know what, I'm just going to float it out there that I'm going to go against these guys, and other people can come in and say, this guy doesn't have Harden, he doesn't have, LeBron. I'm definitely going to go and jump in and play at that situation. Nothing like that is available in DFS?
No, you can't see who people have got in their lineups. You can obviously avoid the player themselves, or the user themselves, but you can't see who they've got in their lineup, because obviously it can get changed anyway. So you could put your lineup in there and then a minute before lock go and change it anyway. So the lineup only gets revealed once the games are locked. So you can't see who you can see your opponent, but you can't see who they're using. I don't really see them changing something like that, because it does take away. It takes away, I guess, some of the level of edge you can get, but it also leads to confusion with that, being able to just completely, you can put a dummy lineup in for the whole time, and then 1 minute before just put a whole new one in, and that changes things as well. So part of the skill and the challenge is trying to work out what players are going to be owned, who's going to use what, and go with it from that. And if you added that part in where you could see lineups and then they just change, it would be against the fish, so to speak. The casual users would hurt a lot more from that, I think.
Yep. What about draft? Obviously, you got draft at the start of the season and things like that. Are there offerings where you can sort of have a draft situation where you go first and take Westbrook, I go next, take LeBron, so on and so forth? Or is it simply a closed scenario where you pick your team and it's locked in at lockout time?
No, that is starting now as well. There's a company called Draft themselves that do that. You have 2-player, 3-player, 4-player, and you pick it that way. Your first pick, second pick, third pick, and build your teams that way. No salary cap, but based on the old standard fantasy draft format, and then go head to head. And that's something that is starting to take off now. I believe that company Draft was just purchased by a UK betting company, Paddy Power. That's them. Yeah. So Paddy Power purchased them, and they were small. They used to advertise on my podcast actually when they were just starting out, and obviously that's starting to take off with a pretty significant investment from Paddy Power. So that is something that is coming in, and it is a really interesting way. And I think it's something that could really work, just because you don't have that issue of bought lineups or generate people generating multiple entries. That goes away in that sort of a scenario, because as soon as the first pick's made, then everything just changes, and you can't plan for that with pre-bought lineups or software generating optimal things. You just can't do it.
Yep. Yeah, it's more person versus person rather than man and computer versus someone else and their computer. So I guess on that line, what has to be your coverage for college basketball then? Obviously, you go in deep and in depth with the NBA stuff. Is there any sort of coverage you have to do for college basketball, or do you do any?
Yes and no. Like, I don't watch as much college basketball during the season as I'd like, but this portion of the year, it's a lot. It's me reading a lot of stuff. So, reading things by guys like Kevin O'Connor's a guy that I read a lot of, all the Draft Express stuff, Mike Schmitz's videos, going back and watching past games. Just listening to smart people talk about these prospects, guys like Sam Vecini. I listen to a lot with his podcast. Cole Zwicker's another guy who's got a couple of NBA draft podcasts. I listen to those guys a lot and really start to get into it now and get a base on all these prospects that are coming in, and that really helps. As I said early on, back at the start of this show, having an understanding of what every player is, what their strengths are, how they work, and then you've got this new incoming class of 60 blokes that come into the league, and I've got to start getting an understanding of that. So once we hit May, it's me researching these guys, how they fit with their teams, how they move onto their teams, and then I go over to Las Vegas Summer League each year as well and watch them in their summer league environment, keep an eye on some of these lesser known players that might take 3-4 years to really start to become impactful and speaking to people over there. So that's the portion of my college research is May, June, July, going back over this stuff and forming my opinions, whereas during the season I just listen to stuff and hear the names and start to build it, but really get into it and start forming my own opinions at this time of the year.
So what are some of the things you're listening for in those podcasts and listening to some of those people, or what are some of the things you're reading to find out? Is it just, I guess, the upside on some of these players and what their projections are supposed to be in year 1 versus year 3 and year 5, or what are some of the things that you're sort of interested in from those different sources?
Well, we have our own formulas for converting college and international stats to rookie year stats, and then how that progresses to second, third year, and all that sort of stuff, conversion rate. So I've done all that for the top 100 prospects already. So I've got an idea what their fantasy stats will look like. Obviously, that's team independent because we don't know where they're going. But what I try to listen to or read with these guys that I listen to is, what are the players' strengths and weaknesses? How does that then fit into the current NBA environment? And then when they get drafted, how does that fit to their current team and what they're going to be asked to do for that team? Are they going to have this weakness that is going to be a real problem based on what their role is going to be with their new team, or is it something that it's not going to matter? So a point guard, say for example, Kyrie Irving wasn't in Cleveland, but a point guard going to Cleveland doesn't need to be ball dominant and be this awesome passer because they've got LeBron there. So they have to have a different set of skills. They need to be a scorer. They need to be able to do different things. They work as a secondary ball handler versus as a primary ball handler. But you go to another team and those skills might not translate into that same spot. So there is a lot of stuff that you want to look at, but it's more just getting an overall picture of the player. What do they excel at? Are they a really good rebounder? Are they an awesome shot blocker? Are they someone who scores a lot, but it's not going to be translatable to the NBA because it's based on them hitting a fluky amount of their threes in their first year when they can't hit their free throws? Example was a guy, say, like Brandon Ingram this year, who was a 40% three-point shooter at Duke last year, but I had my concerns given he couldn't shoot three-pointers at all in high school. He's a really bad free throw shooter, and those things tend to align. And then he came into the NBA this year and sucked for 70 of his 80 games that he played, and getting that idea of what's real, what's not, and where is the development for this player.
So how valuable is that insight and that information for you? Does it help your DFS lineups at all, having those rookies? Are they a large portion, or do they impact much on your DFS lineups, or are they more for the dynasty leagues and the long-term stuff?
No, they work in DFS as well, especially when they maybe get a surprise start because they'll come in as a cheap option. And but a lot of the time rookies get overvalued because it's the new thing, the new sexy sort of a guy. So they price them up a little bit, and people over-own them, and that can be an issue as well, expecting more out of a player. So, for example, like a Brandon Ingram, he might have been a minimum salary player all year, but he was priced at, say, $800 over that just because of the allure of someone new, and people would use him, and his ownership would be 10-15% higher than what it needed to be, and he would never return 5x value. So that's being important to understand, and having a realistic expectation of that based on the current class of guys coming in, but just the historical impact of rookies is always overestimated at the beginning of the year, and it takes a while for people to catch on to that.
So how long does it take to get a handle on some of those rookies coming out? Because I'm sure whether it's Buddy Hield, who's had a big tournament, or some of these Kentucky guys who are coming out after only playing a handful of games sometimes. Is it depending on the player, or can you sort of get a good handle on them and what impact they're going to have on your fantasy season pretty early?
You can have a fairly good idea. There's always the couple of surprises that come out, but in general, you can. It's easy to look from a fantasy point of view and say, I don't think this guy is going to be as successful as what you might think, and this guy will be more successful. And I've got a pretty good track record of being able to pick that sort of stuff. Like I was pretty big on Malcolm Brogdon heading into this season, and that obviously turned out pretty well. I was obviously down on Chris Dunn and Brandon Ingram and Buddy Hield, and they didn't do the things that they were supposed to do. And having an understanding that it's not hard to do. But there's always mistakes that you make with that in either direction, guys that you didn't think was necessarily going to be good. But there's a difference between a guy being a good player and being a good fantasy player as well. So, for example, Jaylen Brown in Boston, he had a really good rookie season. I was impressed with him, much better than I thought he would do. But he's a bad fantasy player. Like, he doesn't rack up any sort of stats and never provides enough value from season long or DFS point of view. And that's a big difference. Whereas there are some guys, say like Chris Dunn, who was really bad and was a terrible NBA player for all of the season. But if he did get 30 minutes, then his ability to rack up 3-4 steals and get 6 assists really boosted his fantasy value, and it got high because he was forced into a situation with minutes, but you know that his ability wasn't allowing him to get minutes on a regular basis.
Yep. Okay, makes sense. So what? I don't know the answer to this question, but given the NCAA and how they handle things, I think I might. Is there any DFS for college? How does that work?
Not anymore. There used to be, and it got shut down. They said, "Look, you can't." What was that?
It just flopped, or did the NCAA come in and say this is not going to happen?
No, the NCAA said you can't do that. That was back maybe 2 years ago as part of when there was the all the legal challenges. The DFS is still undergoing some of that, but not really anymore. But that was part of it. It was like, okay, you can do this, but you can't have college sports anymore.
Yeah, because I mean, on the college football side, how popular that is, and I guess it's sort of the same for the March Madness type stuff. I guess the bracketology takes over a lot of that, but it still would be I guess it would be something that those sites probably looked at getting into and thought, given all of the regulation issues and the legal issues they were having, it just wasn't worth the fight, given how the NCAA has handled other legal matters in the past. So I guess it sort of makes some sense. So the NBA draft's coming up. It's later in June. Do you have any opinions on a couple of the top guys? Obviously, Lonzo Ball here is never out of the newspapers. His old man is never out of the spotlight. You've obviously got Fultz and a few other guys who are sort of high up on the draft boards. You got any opinions, or sort of based on your sort of work so far with the rookies next year, how some of those guys might go and where they might fall in the draft?
Yes, so I am super pumped for the draft. I love the NBA draft. I love looking at these guys. Lonzo Ball, yeah, look, we all have our opinions on what LeVar's doing. I'm not sold that Lonzo is going to be a good player. I think he's got significant bust potential, and this was a stat that I brought up on the podcast the other day. Jake, I'll ask you. You might have an idea. I'd be stunned if you were able to guess it straight away. But when was the last time that the first 2 picks in the NBA draft made an All-Star game? Not in the same year, but pick number 1 and pick number 2. When was the last time that those 2 players had made an All-Star game?
It's a great question. I mean, I could tell you one a fair few times. 2, it's been a while, I would imagine. Yeah, you've got me.
The last time that the first pick and the second pick in the draft made an All-Star game, not in the same year, just in their entire career, was 1999. So we're talking 18 years ago. It was Elton Brand and Steve Francis. So you can talk about people, and this is what I talk about when people overvalue rookies and say, oh, man, we're going to draft Lonzo Ball. Let's trade D'Angelo Russell. Let's trade up and get this pick. Oh, these guys are definite stars. They're not, because the first 2 picks have never been an All-Star together for 18 years. The 2 players who did it last aren't even in the NBA anymore. So everyone who picked pick 2 or pick 1 back in that time, they thought they were getting a star, and they weren't. They just weren't. So you had those first 2 picks. Even if you had them as the same team, you were getting one good player and one guy who's not an All-Star, and maybe not even one that was an All-Star level player. You can go back and see all the history of the number 2 picks that were terrible. Darko Milicic obviously is one of those guys that stand out. Hashim Thabit, like these picks at number 2, or any pick doesn't work out. There's such high bust potential, but everyone seems to look at these guys and go, "Nah, stud, we have to trade away all our players." I remember getting into an argument with someone saying, "Oh, the Suns, if they're going to get picked 2, they'll draft Lonzo. Let's go trade Eric Bledsoe straight away." What if Lonzo's terrible? There's a distinct, probably high 15% chance that he's terrible.
Yeah,
and that's the same you could say for anybody in that first round. Josh Jackson, any of these guys, they could be terrible. Markelle Fultz could be bad. He could be Anthony Bennett. I don't think he is. I'm pretty confident in Markelle Fultz being a good player and above average starter, but I don't think he's necessarily 100% locked in to be a star. And as we know from history, these guys, even the first 2 guys, they might not be good. So that is something that people need to look at. In terms of players that I like Fultz a lot, I really like Dennis Smith Jr. from NC State. I think he's going to be a real interesting player. We can talk about his deficiencies from last year, but he was coming off an ACL injury. So we do have to bear that in mind. And yes, you can bear it in mind that, hey, he's had an ACL, that's bad. But the fact that he was able to do what he did as he recovered from an ACL injury was pretty impressive. And he was like a number 1 or number 2 prospect before the ACL. So I really like him heading up. And guys like Jonathan Isaac, Frank Ntilikina, I'm a pretty big fan of those sort of guys in that top 10 zone as well.
I know there's very limited betting. Is there any sort of DFS style stuff on the draft, or is there any sort of, other than a interested fan watching on, will there be any investment on your side with the draft?
No, nothing like that. Not that I've seen. There are things we can go in and submit your mock draft and your accuracy. You might win a T-shirt or something like that, but I've never seen anything that's really significant. Look, there might be player prop bets. Will Lonzo Ball be over under pick 1.5 or something like that? And as you get further down the draft, you can get a little bit more edge out of that, but not something I've ever looked into. I'm looking at it more as an entertainment thing and let's see how these players fit. How does this make sense? And then trying to translate that into fantasy information, because people doing dynasty leagues, they'll often have their rookie draft 2 days after the NBA draft. So I've got to be putting out that information pretty much straight away. That's why I've done all my player projections already for these guys, and then that will be fine-tuned as we head through August, as we start to bring all the players together with free agency, but having an idea of how. And when you look at that, I've got the top 100 prospects, and you look at the list of who is the most fantasy friendly, it doesn't go in terms of how these guys are going to get drafted. Like Markel Fultz was maybe the 15th guy. Ball was like the 6th guy. Players like Josh Jackson was maybe 70th on that list. So it doesn't necessarily line up, and then it comes down to fantasy value versus minutes versus role growth and all that sort of stuff, is to try and determine how these players are going to pan out.
Yep. Okay. And what about any trades on draft day or anything like that? Do you foresee any possibilities with that, or these players aren't sort of bona fide stars necessarily who are worth mortgaging some picks? As we've seen in the past, it hasn't necessarily worked out for the Brooklyns of the world.
Yeah, I don't see it happening. I don't see Boston trading that pick one. I don't see Jimmy Butler getting moved. I don't see Paul George getting moved. I don't see. There'll be some trades. There'll be some minor trades. We saw it last year with the Suns and the Kings, swapping Bogdanovic and those picks for the Suns to move up into pick 8. And you saw it a couple of years ago with the Hawks and the Knicks, switching Jaren Grant for Tim Hardaway during the draft. Kelly Oubre as a trade also between Washington and Atlanta. Just that sort of a level of thing. I don't see superstar movement. I don't see Butler and George are obviously the two big names. I can't see Boston parting with pick 1. I don't see either of those guys getting moved at the draft. There'll be more lower level stuff.
I guess we'll find out pretty soon. I have one more DFS question before I ask you a couple of general questions. Obviously, your NBA acumen's pretty high up there, so I want to touch on a couple of things before we finish. So, if I was to ask you who's the greatest DFS NBA player of all time, who would that be?
Of all time, it's hard to go past Westbrook, especially with what he's done this season, what he did in the start of 2015 when Durant was out with that foot injury. The numbers that he was putting up were ridiculous. That he was just consistent. Like Harden was pretty good this year, but Westbrook was just dropping 70, 75 points pretty much every single day. And the salary got to levels I'd never seen before. You're talking about high-priced guys normally at $12,000. He was sitting at like $14,000 at times. Just prices that made him not a value option at all. And then somehow he still was able to bring back value and just keep churning it out on a consistent basis. So it is hard to go past Westbrook, but maybe that's recency bias chiming in.
Yeah, perhaps. And what about on the value side and maybe the last couple of seasons? Who have you used or who have you had in your lineups quite often who consistently was undervalued and just sort of, ground out profits for you over that time? Is there any one or two players that stick out?
Not that I can think of, but there are players who people discount quite quickly, and that can lead to their ownership percentage dropping and their salary dropping quicker than it should. And there are certain players like that. One guy that was like that for a while was Nicola Batum for the Hornets, and when he was with the Trailblazers, his faith, or the faith that people had in him, would drop pretty quickly. So that could be a way to go. But I'm very much of the mindset of people are quite reactionary, and I'm sure this happens in the betting world as well. Is that someone will play Anthony Davis, and they'll have a bad game, or Davis will get injured, and they'll say, never using him again. Killed me. He's on my do not use list. Can't ever roster him. I go, you're just losing money by having that mindset. Like you've got to be able to reset it every day. You can't say, this is my favorite player, I'm playing him. In general, the way that, as much as I love the NBA and love watching it, but these are just sets of numbers with a face attached to it. and you've got to look at them as numbers rather than as this is the player that I like, or I hate Carmelo Anthony, I'm never going to use him. Well, that's cool, but what if he falls down and becomes a $5,000 player? Then it becomes absolute no-brainer, and you use him and you do it even though you don't like his personality for the fact that he wears a long sleeve jumper under his uniform, whatever it is. But that sort of mindset is a losing mindset, I think.
Yeah, okay. 3 more questions before I let you go. Jordan, LeBron, NBA Finals, and Sam Hinkie. So we mentioned a little bit before about the draft pick scenario and potential of that happening. Do you have any thoughts on, in general, Sam Hinkie and how he went about it in his time? Obviously, you're probably seeing in the DFS world certain players with a contrarian attitude, and Sam Hinkie probably falls into that sort of bucket. Any thoughts on his approach to sort of managing an NBA franchise?
Yeah, I loved it. I loved what he did. He obviously made mistakes at time here. The Jolly Okafor pick hasn't worked out, but I don't think there's anyone who was in that spot that wouldn't have picked him. He was all about trying to get talent, and yes, picking the center 3 years in a row, probably not ideal, but we didn't know what was happening with Joel Embiid at that point, whether he would ever be able to come back when Okafor selection was made. Didn't work out. He probably should have gone a little bit harder in terms of getting a decent point guard in free agency at some point, but the moves he's made have been fine. That the Kings pick swap was obviously worked out in their favour this year. They've got a 2019 unprotected pick coming from the Kings. The Michael Carter-Williams trade, they've got an unprotected first from the Lakers coming next year, and the Lakers are going to be terrible. So that's a potential another top 3 pick for Michael Carter-Williams, who honestly, he might not even be in the league in 2 years' time. Everything that I was, there were mistakes, but in general, the moves that Hinkie made sense. Now, maybe he approached it a little bit too much, like I just mentioned about talking about fantasy, about these guys are a set of numbers without faces and names and personalities, and that's a problem. But you can't say that the players don't like him. You hear everything that Embiid will go on and talk about with Hinkie, and guys like Robert Covington, Rashawn Holmes, TJ McConnell that Hinkie gave this opportunity to. They would have to be really thankful of what he did. And I'm always critical of people who are not results driven, but ignore the process, not to use that term deliberately. But Hinkie's was about using the process to give him the best chance of getting the result. And if it didn't work, it didn't work. But what he did, I thought, was the right method to going about doing it. And people do it to it. You're instilling a losing culture in this team. It's all too young. Jacob, I don't believe in that. These players are all winners. They win every game they play in high school. They win all these games in college. They don't come into the NBA for 2 years and then all of a sudden forget what it's like to win and forget, we don't have a veteran leader on this team. Experience in that veteran leadership at times are a little bit overrated. Look, you saw it last year here in the AFL with the Bulldogs winning the premiership. No grand final players in that team. One of the youngest teams in the league, and that didn't matter because if you build it up internally, it's I don't know. I find the criticisms of Hinkie really curious.
Congratulations on the Bulldogs, by the way.
Thank you.
Percentage chance of Hinkie getting another job in the next, say, 3 to 5 years?
I don't know if he wants a job, to be honest, in the NBA. I would say it's pretty high, though. If he is interested, I would say someone would go back, especially with the way things are panning out for the Sixers at the moment. I think that he will. I think he'll get a job somewhere. Yeah,
it sounds like he'll be on the right side of history on that one. So, Jordan versus LeBron. 1 minute on that. What's your thoughts there?
I think that they're the clear best 2 players. I'm still a Jordan guy marginally, but it's really close. And if anyone comes to you and says that it's clear cut or that it's laughable that you compare them, I think they are wrong. You have to me, they're clearly the best 2 players, and you could make an argument for either of them. I would still have Jordan marginally ahead, but LeBron's got 4, 5, maybe 8 more years of his career left, and by then, this might not even be a discussion.
Yeah, it seems to be going that way. Obviously, recency bias, but he sort of looks like he's going to be able to do it all on many different teams, different shapes and sizes. So I guess we'll see. And it seems like the level of competition in the finals that he comes up against compared to what Jordan had is a little bit different. But obviously, we'll see. One more question before I let you go, and I really, really appreciate all of your time. NBA Finals, how do you see it playing out? What do you expect coming up?
I think the Warriors will. I think the Warriors will smack them. I think that they'll get them in 5. The Cavs have been super impressive, obviously, but I just feel like the Warriors have been going in second gear for the majority of these playoffs. I just feel like they haven't even put the foot down, and you get the feeling that the Cavs, they were deliberately putting the foot on the Celtics and killing them, and rightfully so. But you feel like the Warriors just weren't actually going that hard. And they were limiting guys like Andre Iguodala. He was playing like 18 minutes a game in that Spurs series. Durant missed some time against Portland. And when the going gets tough, like Iggy will go and play 35 minutes. And Durant and Curry will play 40. They won't play the 31 or 32. I just feel like the Warriors have got multiple years to go up. And yes, LeBron's ridiculous. He's been just at the age of 32. The stuff that he's doing is crazy. But I just think that the Warriors will smack him.
Okay, we'll see. I think even if LeBron has 35, 12 and 12, it might not be enough. But I guess we'll certainly see. Josh, where can listeners find you? Can you want to run through some of the spots where they can reach you on Twitter, your podcast, and the site, and those type of things?
Okay, so on Twitter, you can find me at redrock_bball. That's my Twitter account there, and our Basketball Monster Twitter account where we announce all the, we try and be as on top of, we are on top of all the news that comes down. So, lineup changes, injury information gets tweeted out immediately over there. That's at Bask Monster, and that's where you can find it, which is going to be helpful for DFS players and for sports bettors as well. That information that comes out, we tweet all that stuff out. As it happens, of course, basketballmonster.com is the website that all my projections and stuff is at. And you can search for my podcast wherever you find good podcasts, and that is Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Even when you find bad podcasts, I imagine it's there too.
Certainly alongside bad ones like this one, I'm sure. So thank you very much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. All the best with the rest of the season. Enjoy the finals, enjoy the draft. And it was great having a chat, all things DFS and basketball.
No problem, Jake. Thank you.